Not scared, not angry, but genuinely ashamed? Like it knew it had done something wrong, something messy, something it couldn't quite explain? That's the look that stopped me dead in my tracks that drizzly October afternoon, a look carried in the wide, dilated pupils of a stray cat holding something terrible in its mouth. It was Tuesday, October 14th, 2025. 3:30 p.m. The kind of late autumn day where the light never truly arrives. Just a damp, gray twilight that seeps into your bones from dawn till dusk. Rain wasn't falling hard, just a persistent mist clinging to the windshield of my battered Subaru, blurring the already faded lines of the parking lot behind the old Cedar Creek Library. Inside, the air hummed with the quiet desperation of fluorescent lights and the faint scent of dust and aging paper, a smell that usually felt like a comfort, a shield. Not today. Today it just felt hollow. My name is Maya. Maya Evans. And 7 weeks ago, my world folded in on itself. A sudden, brutal stroke in the middle of the night, gone before the ambulance even turned onto our street. The carefully constructed life I'd built in the city, the demanding marketing job, the overpriced apartment, the carefully curated friendships that evaporated faster than spilled coffee, it all crumbled under the weight of that loss. What was the point of strategizing ad campaigns when the man who taught me to ride a bike, who patiently explained constellations on summer nights, who always answered the phone on the second ring, was just gone? So I ran. Or maybe I crawled. Back to Cedar Creek, the sleepy Oregon mountain town I'd fled a decade ago. Back to Dad's little house on Spruce Street, a place saturated with his absence. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like his footsteps. The worn armchair in the den still held the ghostly imprint of his shape. His flannel shirts hung untouched in the closet, smelling faintly of sawdust and Old Spice. The silence there wasn't peaceful. It was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until breathing felt like a chore. I'd taken a part-time job reshelving books at the library, a simple, mindless task that required just enough focus to keep the tidal wave of grief at bay for a few hours. It was a stopgap, a flimsy raft in a stormy sea. I didn't know what came next. Didn't have the energy to care. That Tuesday, I was lingering in the staff break room, nursing a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea I didn't really want. Staring out the rain-streaked window at the soggy patch of woods bordering the library's backlot. The world outside looked washed out, muted greens and browns blurring into the gray sky. My reflection in the glass looked washed out too, pale skin, dark circles under eyes that hadn't sparkled in weeks. I felt untethered, adrift in my own skin. The low murmur of patrons in the main hall felt miles away. I was just about to force myself back to the stacks, back to the mindless alphabetizing of travel guides, when movement caught my eye. Down by the tree line, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper gloom beneath the dripping firs. It was a cat. Lean, almost gaunt, a study in varying shades of gray and charcoal. Not sleek, but not mangy either. Just wiry. Her fur was plastered dark against her frame by the mist. She moved with a feral caution, low to the ground, ears swiveling constantly, taking 3 steps, then freezing, scanning, then 3 more. She wasn't heading towards the library dumpsters. She was paralleling the tree line, her focus intense, almost urgent. Something about her stillness, the absolute concentration in her posture, held me. She wasn't just hunting, she was on a mission. I'd seen her before. Over the past few weeks, glimpses. A flash of gray darting under the porch of the abandoned laundromat next door. A pair of luminous green eyes reflecting my headlights late one evening as I pulled into my driveway. Once, I'd put out a small bowl of tuna near the library's back steps, more out of a vague sense of obligation to something living than any real hope. The next morning, the bowl was licked clean, but she was nowhere to be seen. She was a ghost, a silent, watchful presence on the periphery of my numb existence. But this felt different. She paused again, this time lifting her head, nostrils flaring. Her gaze swept across the parking lot, the dumpsters, and landed squarely on the break room window. On me. We locked eyes. The distance was maybe 30 yards, but the intensity of her stare was unnerving. It wasn't the blank curiosity of a stray assessing a potential food source. There was a startling depth there, an ancient, knowing intelligence, and something else. A raw, unsettling anxiety. She held my gaze for 5 long seconds, the kind of seconds that stretch and thicken. Then, with a fluid motion that belied her earlier caution, she turned and melted back into the dripping underbrush. Gone. A strange little shiver traced its way down my spine. Not fear, but a prickling sense of connection? Or maybe just the shock of being truly seen by something, anything, for the first time in weeks. I shook my head, dismissing it as grief-induced weirdness. Just a feral cat. Probably had a nest of kittens hidden somewhere, making her extra skittish. I dumped the cold dregs of my tea in the sink, the clatter loud in the quiet room, and pushed through the swinging door back into the hushed world of books. The rest of my shift passed in the usual blur. The rhythmic thump of books hitting the reshelving cart. The soft sigh of pages turning in quiet corners. The low drone of the librarian explaining the photocopier. Again, my body went through the motions, but my mind kept drifting back to those green eyes, that palpable anxiety in the damp air. Why had she looked at me like that? What mission had I interrupted? 4:30 finally rolled around. Clockout time. I shrugged into my worn, olive green rain jacket, Dad's old one, still smelling faintly of him, grabbed my tote bag, and pushed through the library's heavy back door. The mist had thickened into a proper drizzle now, cold and insistent. I hunched my shoulders, fumbling in my pocket for my car keys, the wet asphalt gleaming under the weak security light. The woods were a dark, hulking presence just beyond the chain-link fence. I clicked the fob, the Subaru's lights flashing yellow in the gloom, and that's when I saw her again. She was sitting, not hiding, not slinking, sitting bolt upright, right in the middle of the empty parking space next to my car. Like she'd been waiting. Raindrops beaded on her gray fur, making her look like she'd been dusted with tiny diamonds. Water streamed down her whiskers. But it was her eyes that seized me, wide, impossibly green, fixed on me with an intensity that stopped my breath. And in her mouth, she held something. Soggy. Clutched gently, almost tenderly, between her small, sharp teeth. Even from 6 feet away, in the dim, rainy light, the color registered. A deep, wet crimson, staining the ragged gray fabric of what looked like a tiny, handmade mouse toy. Blood. Fresh, dark blood. My stomach lurched. Had she killed something? A bird? A squirrel? Why bring it here? Why show me? I froze, keys dangling uselessly from my fingers. The drizzle hissed on the pavement. The only other sound was the frantic hammering of my own heart against my ribs. She didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there, rigid, holding that awful, sodden offering, staring at me with those impossible eyes. And that's when I saw it, the look I mentioned at the start. Guilt. Profound, soul-deep guilt, mixed with a desperate, pleading hope. It was etched into every line of her wet face, in the slight tremble of her jaw holding the toy, in the way her ears lay flat against her skull, not in aggression, but in abject shame. She looked like a child caught doing something unspeakably bad, but driven by a reason only she understood. Her whole body vibrated with a silent plea. I know this looks terrible, but please, please understand. Please follow. The air crackled. The mundane world of the library parking lot fell away. It was just me, this trembling, rain-soaked creature, and the dark, wet stains spreading on the pathetic little toy clutched in her jaws. The grief inside me, the hollow ache I carried like a second skeleton, resonated with the raw desperation radiating from her. It was a mirror held up in the rain, reflecting back a different kind of pain, but pain nonetheless. She took a single, hesitant step towards me. Then another. Her eyes never left mine. The blood-stained toy bobbed slightly with her movement. A drop of diluted crimson dripped onto the wet asphalt, a tiny, dark flower blooming instantly before the rain washed it away. This wasn't just a stray cat with prey. This was the beginning of something. Something important. Something terrifying. Something that felt, in that suspended, rain-soaked moment, like the first fragile thread thrown across the chasm of my isolation, offered by a creature just as lost, just as desperate as I was. The quiet shift wasn't just in the weather, it was deep inside my own numb heart. A tiny, terrified click, like the first tumbler in a lock turning. She took another step. Closer. Waiting. What was she asking? What terrible, necessary thing lay behind those guilt-ridden green eyes, and the blood on the toy? The drizzle felt suddenly colder, the woods behind her darker, the silence heavier. The story, our story, wasn't just beginning. It was demanding to be seen. And I, adrift in my sea of grief, found I couldn't look away. The rain hissed on the asphalt, a cold, steady percussion against the frantic drumming in Maya's chest. 6 feet. That's all that separated her from the trembling gray cat and the blood-darkened toy held like a grim offering in its jaws. The air hung thick, charged with unspoken terror and that unbearable, pleading guilt in the cat's wide green eyes. Follow. The word wasn't spoken, wasn't even a meow. It was a silent scream vibrating in the space between them, resonating with the hollow ache inside Maya herself. Her fingers, numb from cold and shock, finally closed around her car keys. The metallic click shattered the fragile tension. The cat flinched violently, a full-body shudder rippling through its wet frame. The toy slipped slightly in its mouth, another dark bead of diluted crimson welling at the seam of the ragged gray fabric before splattering onto the wet ground. Maya froze again, holding her breath. Don't run. Please don't run. The cat didn't run. It took another hesitant, wobbling step forward. Closer. 5 feet now. The rain plastered its fur flat, revealing the sharp lines of ribs beneath, the delicate structure of its skull. Up close, Maya saw details she'd missed. A small, healed notch in the left ear, a faint, silvery scar tracing a line across its muzzle. This was a creature acquainted with hardship. The guilt in its eyes wasn't just for the blood. It felt deeper, older. A constant companion. Maya's throat tightened. Logic screamed, wild animal. Disease. Rabies. Get in the car. Drive away. But the echo of that silent plea, the raw, mirroring desperation, it anchored her feet to the slick pavement. Her own grief, a suffocating blanket for weeks, felt suddenly porous, pierced by the sharp point of this creature's suffering. She wasn't the only one drowning. Slowly, deliberately, Maya lowered her hand holding the keys. Not a threat. She crouched, bringing herself closer to the cat's level, the damp asphalt immediately soaking through the knees of her jeans. A cold shock. The cat watched her every micro-movement, muscles coiled tight, ready to bolt. Its breath hitched, visible as tiny puffs of vapor in the chilly air. Maya could smell the wet fur now, a damp, earthy scent mixed with something metallic and faintly coppery, the blood. "Okay," Maya whispered, her voice raspy, unfamiliar even to herself. It was the first word she'd spoken with any real intent since before. "I see you." The cat's ears twitched. Its gaze flickered from Maya's eyes to her lowered hand, then back. The intensity didn't lessen, but the rigid trembling in its shoulders eased, just a fraction. It took another step. 4 feet. The bloodied toy remained clamped in its jaws, a dark, wet punctuation mark to its plea. "What is it?" Maya murmured, keeping her voice low and steady, the way she'd once spoken to a spooked horse on a childhood friend's farm. "What do you want me to see?" The cat stared. Then, with infinite slowness, it turned its head slightly towards the dense, dripping woods behind the chain-link fence. It looked back at Maya. "That way." The message was clear. Then, its gaze dropped pointedly to the toy in its mouth, then back up to her eyes. Because of this, the drizzle intensified, cold rivulets tracing paths down Maya's neck beneath her collar. The woods looked impenetrable in the fading light, a wall of wet, dark green and skeletal branches. The thought of following a feral cat into that gloom, guided only by a blood-stained rag, it was madness. Absolute, terrifying madness. Yet the alternative, getting back into her car, driving back to the echoing silence of Dad's house, leaving this trembling, guilt-ridden creature with its awful secret, felt like a different kind of surrender. A confirmation of the numbness that had been her only refuge. This was feeling. Raw, terrifying, but alive. "I can't go in there right now," Maya said, the admission scraping her throat. She gestured vaguely towards the woods, then the heavy sky. "It's getting dark." Then she trailed off, unable to articulate the primal fear, the sheer impracticality. "Tomorrow. In the light. Can you show me tomorrow?" The cat's head tilted, just a fraction. Its eyes narrowed slightly, processing. Maya held her breath. Would it understand? Or was this fragile, rain-soaked connection about to snap? The seconds stretched, filled only with the hiss of rain and Maya's pounding heart. Then, with a soft, almost inaudible muffled by the toy, the cat lowered its head. Not a nod, but a subtle dip of acknowledgement, or perhaps just exhaustion. It didn't move towards the woods. Instead, it took one more step towards Maya, then another, until it was barely 3 feet away. It stopped, hesitated. Then, with a movement so quick Maya almost missed it, it darted forward, dropped the blood-stained toy mouse squarely on the wet toe of her boot, and leaped back several feet in a single, fluid bound. It landed lightly, instantly regaining its tense posture, eyes fixed on the toy and on Maya. The offering had been delivered. The plea remained. "Take it. Understand." Maya stared down at the small, sodden thing on her boot. The fabric was cheap felt, torn, gray except for the dark, spreading stain. It was crudely made, perhaps stuffed with catnip once, now just a limp, bloody sack. Revulsion warred with a profound, aching pity. This object meant something important to this cat. Something worth braving a human for. Something worth the guilt. Slowly, moving as if handling something infinitely fragile and dangerous, Maya bent and picked up the toy. It was cold and damp in her fingers, heavier than it looked, saturated. The coppery smell was stronger now, unmistakable. She held it gingerly, avoiding the darkest patch. The cat watched her intently, its whole body still vibrating with tension, but its eyes held a new layer, wary expectation. "I'll keep it," Maya whispered, meeting its gaze. "Safe. Until tomorrow." She didn't know if the concept of tomorrow translated, but the tone seemed to register. The cat's rigid posture softened another infinitesimal degree. Its tail, held low and stiff, gave a single, tiny flick. Then, without warning, it turned. Not towards the woods, but towards the deeper shadows behind the library dumpsters. It paused once, looked back at Maya holding the toy, gave another soft, muffled "Emma," and then vanished into the gloom like smoke. Maya was left standing alone in the rainy parking lot, the cold, wet weight of the blood-stained toy in her hand, the ghost of those desperate green eyes imprinted on her vision. The numbness was gone. In its place was a cold dread, a thrumming curiosity, and a thread of connection so thin it felt like it might dissolve in the rain, yet somehow anchoring. She carefully wrapped the toy in an old grocery receipt from her pocket, a flimsy shroud, and placed it in her tote bag. The drive home was a blur of rain-smeared headlights and the phantom scent of wet fur and blood. The silence in Dad's house felt different when she entered. Not just absence, but anticipation. She placed the wrapped toy on the worn oak kitchen table, a stark, unsettling presence amidst the familiar clutter of Dad's life. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle of wind against the eaves, every creak of the settling house, sounded like the cautious pad of small feet. She lay rigid in her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, the image of the cat's guilt-stricken face replaying on the dark canvas. What happened? What's in those woods? Dawn broke, gray and tentative, filtering through rain-streaked windows. Maya was already dressed, moving through the quiet house with a purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. She made coffee, the familiar ritual feeling strangely alien. Her gaze kept drifting to the small, wrapped bundle on the table. She couldn't bring herself to unwrap it, to confront the stain in the harsh light of day. Not yet. She packed a small backpack, a flashlight, though it was morning, the woods were dense, a bottle of water, an old towel, a can of tuna she found in the back of Dad's pantry, and a small first aid kit, a vague, unsettling precaution. She hesitated, then added the wrapped toy. It felt like a key, a terrible, necessary key. The library parking lot was deserted when she arrived, early before her shift. The air was still damp, smelling of wet earth and decaying leaves. The woods loomed, less menacing in the pale gray light, but no less mysterious. She walked to the spot where the cat had appeared the day before, near the tree line by the chain-link fence. She scanned the underbrush, the dripping ferns, the dark trunks of the Douglas firs. Nothing. "Hey!" she called softly, feeling foolish. "It's me. I'm here." Her voice sounded small, swallowed by the vastness of the trees. She waited, listening to the drip-drip of water from the branches, the distant cry of a crow. Disappointment, sharp and sudden, pricked at her. Had she imagined the connection? Had the cat changed its mind? She crouched down, placing the backpack on the wet ground. Carefully, she unwrapped the blood-stained toy mouse. The gray felt was darker where the blood had soaked in, stiff now that it had dried somewhat overnight. The metallic scent was fainter but still present, a grim reminder. She placed it gently on a relatively dry patch of moss at the base of a large fir tree. "Look," she said, addressing the silent woods. "I brought it back." She sat back on her heels, waiting. Minutes ticked by. The chill from the damp ground seeped through her jeans. Doubt gnawed at her. This was ridiculous. She was talking to trees over a bloody cat toy. She was about to stand, to gather her things and chalk it up to grief-induced delusion, when a flicker of movement caught her eye. High up, nestled in the thick branches of the fir tree, partly obscured by drooping boughs heavy with rain, 2 points of green light appeared. The cat. It had been watching her the whole time. It moved with deliberate slowness, descending the tree trunk with the fluid grace of a shadow, using claws for purchase on the rough bark. It jumped the last few feet, landing silently on the moss a few yards away from the toy. It didn't approach the offering immediately. Instead, it sat, regarding Maya with that same intense, unblinking stare. The guilt was still there, a shadow in its eyes, but overlaid now with a cautious assessment. Maya held perfectly still, barely breathing. This was the moment. Would it bolt? Would it take the toy and disappear? Or would it lead? The cat's gaze shifted from Maya to the toy, then back. Its nostrils flared, testing the air. Slowly, deliberately, it rose and walked towards the toy. Not with the urgency of the day before, but with a measured, almost reverent pace. It stopped beside it, lowered its head, and sniffed the stained fabric intently. A low rumble started in its chest, not quite a purr, more like a vibration of profound recognition and sorrow. It nudged the toy gently with its nose, then looked up at Maya. Remember this. Then it turned, not towards the deeper woods, but parallel to the fence line, following the same path Maya had seen it take the previous afternoon. It took a few steps, then paused, looking back over its shoulder at her. Follow. Heart hammering again, Maya scrambled to her feet, grabbing her backpack. She left the toy on the moss. It felt like leaving a marker, a promise to return. She followed the cat, keeping a respectful distance of about 10 feet. The cat moved steadily, not rushing, but with purpose. It stayed close to the fence and the tree line, its body low, ears constantly swiveling, scanning the surroundings. Maya mimicked its caution, stepping carefully over roots and wet ferns, the dampness soaking through her boots. They walked for perhaps 5 minutes, the sounds of the town fading behind them, replaced by the dripping forest, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the occasional distant hammering of a woodpecker. The path wasn't a path at all, just a route the cat navigated with instinctive knowledge around thickets and fallen logs. Maya's anxiety grew with every step. What was she doing? Following a feral cat deeper into unfamiliar woods based on a feeling and a bloody toy? The dense canopy blocked much of the gray morning light, casting everything in deep, green-tinged shadow. The air grew colder, damper. The cat stopped abruptly beside a massive, moss-covered stump, the rotting remnant of an ancient tree. It turned to face Maya, its eyes wide and luminous in the gloom. It let out a single, soft, high-pitched chirp. Maya approached slowly. The stump was enormous, easily 5 feet across, hollowed out by time and decay. Ferns sprouted from its top, and thick moss carpeted its sides, dripping with moisture. The cat stood beside a particular spot near the base, where the decaying wood formed a dark, narrow crevice, partially obscured by hanging moss and a curtain of ivy. It looked at the crevice, then back at Maya, its whole body radiating a tense expectation. The guilt was back in its eyes, mixed now with a desperate hope so potent it felt like a physical force. Please look. Maya's mouth went dry. This was it. The source of the blood. The reason for the guilt. The terrible secret held within the rotting wood. Dread coiled icy in her stomach. What would she find? A dead animal? Something worse? She crouched down, setting her backpack aside. The smell here was stronger, damp rot, rich earth, and beneath it, that faint, persistent coppery tang. She pulled her flashlight from the pack, her hands trembling slightly. Clicking it on, the beam felt intrusive, cutting through the green shadows. The cat watched her, utterly still, barely breathing itself. Maya reached out with her free hand and gently pushed aside the curtain of ivy and moss shielding the crevice. The beam of her flashlight pierced the darkness within the hollow stump. And she froze. It wasn't a dead animal. Nestled deep in the dry, sheltered heart of the rotting wood, cushioned on a bed of shredded bark, moss, and tufts of soft gray fur, were kittens. 4 of them. Tiny, impossibly small, their eyes still tightly shut, their bodies no bigger than Maya's thumb. They were huddled together for warmth, a pile of fragile, sleeping life. But it wasn't the sight of the kittens that stole Maya's breath. It was the 5th one, lying slightly apart from the huddle, unmoving, much smaller than the others. Its tiny body was wrong, misshapen, cold. And on the moss beside it, dark against the green, was a smear of dried blood. The blood that had stained the toy that lay discarded near the nest, a pitiful comfort object, perhaps carried by the mother, now bearing the awful evidence of loss. The mother cat, for there was no doubt now, let out a soft, broken sound. Not a meow. A whimper. Deep, guttural, filled with a sorrow that echoed in Maya's own bones. She stood beside Maya, staring into the nest, her body rigid. The guilt in her eyes wasn't for killing. It was for failing, for not protecting, for bringing this tiny, broken body into the world only to lose it. Maya understood. The blood wasn't violence. It was tragedy. The toy, carried with such desperate shame, wasn't a trophy. It was a relic, a symbol of the life that hadn't made it, perhaps offered as explanation, as proof of her anguish, her need. The icy dread in Maya's stomach melted, replaced by a wave of crushing empathy so profound it brought hot tears stinging to her eyes. She looked from the lifeless kitten to the grieving mother, then to the 4 tiny survivors, still oblivious, breathing shallowly in their mossy cradle. The mother's silent plea yesterday hadn't just been follow. It had been help them. Help me save them. I couldn't save this one. The connection snapped taut, visceral and undeniable. This wasn't just a stray cat. This was a mother shattered by loss, driven by a fierce, terrified love for her remaining babies. Just as Maya felt shattered by her own loss, adrift in a world without her anchor. The parallels were heartbreakingly clear. The mother's desperate act, bringing the blood-stained toy to a human, wasn't just instinct. It was an act of profound, terrifying trust. A leap of faith across an unimaginable gulf of fear and species. Maya slowly lowered the flashlight, its beam now illuminating the mother's face. Tears tracked silently down Maya's own cheeks, mingling with the forest dampness. She didn't reach out to touch the cat. Not yet. But she met its grief-stricken gaze and whispered, the words thick with shared sorrow and dawning resolve. Okay, I see them. I see you. We'll help them. Together. The mother cat didn't move, but the rigid tension in her shoulders eased, just a fraction. Her gaze shifted from Maya's face to the nest, to her living kittens, then back. A fragile bridge, built on shared loss and desperate hope, stretched between woman and cat in the dripping, moss-scented gloom of the hollow stump. The mission had changed. The trust, terrifyingly, had been given. The real work, the fragile tending of life amidst the shadow of death, was just beginning. The damp, Moss-scented air inside the hollow stump hung heavy with the weight of shared sorrow. Maya's whispered promise will help them. Together seemed to vibrate in the small space, a fragile pact sealed over the tiny, broken body and the 4 fragile survivors huddled beside it. The mother cat, her intense green eyes reflecting the beam of Maya's flashlight, didn't purr, didn't rub against her leg. She simply stood, rigid yet slightly less coiled, her gaze fixed on Maya's face, then flicking back to the nest with a vigilance that felt ancient, primal. The guilt hadn't vanished. It had transmuted into a ferocious, desperate protectiveness. The immediate task was terrifyingly clear: get the living kittens warm, safe, and fed. The nest, while sheltered, was damp and cool, unsuitable for newborns. Maya's mind raced, pushing aside the lingering shock. She carefully opened her backpack, pulling out the old towel. Moving with excruciating slowness, telegraphing every movement, she laid the towel flat near the nest opening. The mother cat watched, tense but unmoving, her low, rumbling vibration a constant hum in the quiet. "Okay, Mama," Maya murmured, her voice barely a breath. "I need to move them. Just onto this. It's dry. Warmer." She held her hand palm up near the nest, letting the mother sniff her scent again. The cat stretched her neck forward, nostrils flaring, then gave a tiny, almost imperceptible dip of her head. Permission? Resignation? Maya didn't know. She took it. With trembling fingers, infinitely gentle, she lifted the first kitten. It was impossibly light, warm, its fur soft as thistledown. A tiny squeak escaped it as the cool air hit its skin. Maya's heart clenched. She placed it carefully on the center of the towel, then repeated the process with the other 3, creating a small, warm huddle. The mother cat immediately stepped closer, sniffing each one intently, her rough tongue flicking out to groom a tiny head. She completely ignored the 5th, still form nestled deeper in the bark. The finality of it was a fresh wound. Maya carefully gathered the corners of the towel, lifting the precious bundle. "We're going home," she whispered, more to herself than the cat. "My home. It's safe." She stood slowly, the bundled kittens cradled against her chest. The warmth radiating through the towel was a small, vital comfort against the forest chill. She looked at the mother cat. "Come on. Please." The cat stared at the empty nest, then at the bundle in Maya's arms. Her gaze lingered for a moment on the dark crevice where her lost kitten lay. A soft, guttural sound escaped her, a sound of pure anguish that echoed in Maya's own chest. Then, with a visible shudder, she turned and followed Maya, padding silently behind her as they retraced their path through the dripping woods, back towards the chain-link fence and the library parking lot. The drive to Spruce Street was tense. Maya drove with one hand, the other resting protectively over the towel bundle on the passenger seat, feeling the tiny stirrings within. The mother cat had vanished moments before Maya reached her car, melting back into the underbrush. Maya's heart sank. Had she lost her? Would the mother abandon her kittens now? But as she pulled into her driveway, she saw a flash of gray dart from the neighbor's overgrown rhododendron and slip under the slightly warped boards of Dad's front porch. She was here, watching, waiting. Inside, the house's familiar silence felt charged, different. Maya cleared the kitchen table, spreading the towel out carefully. She set up a makeshift nest in a low cardboard box lined with soft fleece scraps from an old blanket, placing it near the warm radiator. She transferred the kittens, their tiny mules strengthening in the warmer air. Then, she opened a can of tuna, placing it on a saucer just inside the back door she left slightly ajar. An offering. An invitation. She waited, holding her breath. Minutes crawled by. The kittens squirmed, their blind mouths gaping, seeking warmth and food Maya couldn't provide. Panic began to bubble. Had she scared the mother away permanently? Then, a shadow moved at the door. The gray cat slipped inside, low to the ground, ears flat, eyes wide with the terror of entering this human den. She froze, scanning the unfamiliar room, the worn linoleum, the faded curtains, the smell of coffee and dust and human, her whole body vibrating with fear. Her gaze locked onto the box near the radiator, hearing the faint cries of her babies. Hunger and primal need warred with paralyzing terror. Maya sat perfectly still on the floor several feet away, her back against the cabinets. "It's okay," she breathed. "They're here. They're safe. They need you." The cat's eyes darted from Maya to the box, to the open door behind her. Escape beckoned. Safety. The wild unknown. Then, a particularly loud, frantic squeal from one of the kittens pierced the air. The mother flinched. Something in her seemed to snap. With a low, determined growl, not of aggression but of sheer, overriding maternal drive, she darted across the linoleum, leaped into the box, and immediately began frantically licking her babies, her rough tongue stimulating them, checking them over, rumbling a deep, vibrating purr that sounded more like a sob of relief. She settled over them, curling her lean body around the tiny huddle, offering warmth, safety, milk. Maya let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Tears welled up again, this time of profound relief and awe. She'd done it. She'd brought them home. The fragile bridge held. She named the mother cat, silently in her mind, Smoke. For her color, and for the way she moved, silent, elusive, appearing and disappearing like mist. The next 48 hours were a blur of exhaustion and hypervigilance. Maya became Smoke's awkward assistant. She researched frantically online. Kitten care, feeding schedules. Smoke handled that, thankfully. Signs of fading kitten syndrome. She set up a heating pad under half the box, monitored constantly, bought kitten formula just in case, and kept a constant supply of high-quality wet food and fresh water near Smoke's nest. She moved the box to a quiet corner of the living room, away from drafts and noise. Smoke remained intensely wary. She would only leave the box for quick trips to the litter box Maya had set up in the adjoining laundry room or to eat and drink, always moving with lightning speed, ears swiveling, eyes darting nervously, especially if Maya moved too suddenly. She tolerated Maya's presence while she nursed, watching her with unblinking vigilance, but flinched if Maya's hand came too close. The only time Maya saw a flicker of relaxation was when Smoke was actually nursing, her eyes half closed, the deep purr resonating, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and seep into Maya's own bones, a strange, shared lullaby. Maya found herself talking to Smoke constantly, narrating her actions in a low, soothing voice. "Just refilling your water? Smoke. See? Water. The heating pad's okay, just checking the temperature. They're getting so strong. Look at that little gray one pushing." She poured her own loneliness, her unspoken grief for her father, into these one-sided conversations. The house, once echoing with silence, now held the soft sounds of life, tiny mules, Smoke's purring, the rustle of fur against fleece. It was chaotic, messy, and overwhelming, and it filled a small part of the vast emptiness inside her. She started noticing Smoke's subtle personality unfolding. She wasn't just skittish, she was fiercely intelligent, watching Maya's routines, learning the sounds of the can opener, the fridge door. She was incredibly gentle with her kittens, her movements precise and tender, yet her eyes held a deep, watchful sadness. And she was stubborn. She refused the plush cat bed Maya bought, preferring the cardboard box. She ignored the expensive toys, showing interest only in the blood-stained felt mouse Maya had carefully washed, though the stain remained, and placed near the nest. Smoke would sometimes nuzzle it, a low, mournful sound rumbling in her chest, before returning to her vigilant watch over the living kittens. One afternoon, while Smoke was eating, Maya cautiously sat near the box, simply watching the kittens sleep. The smallest, a little gray tabby mirroring Smoke, stirred and let out a soft cry. Instantly, Smoke abandoned her food and was back in the box, nudging the kitten, licking it, rumbling reassurance. The kitten settled. Smoke looked up, her gaze meeting Maya's. It wasn't fear this time. It was acknowledgement, a shared understanding of responsibility, of love tinged with the memory of loss. Maya felt a lump form in her throat. She reached out, slowly, and gently touched the back of her own hand to the edge of the cardboard box, near where Smoke rested. Smoke didn't pull away. She watched Maya's hand, then looked back at her face. Her green eyes held a complex swirl of emotion, residual fear, profound weariness, and something else, a flicker of tentative acceptance. She didn't lean into the touch, but she didn't flee. She held Maya's gaze for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately lowered her head to rest her chin on her paws, her eyes drifting half-closed, though Maya knew she remained alert. A pause with closer, a breath of fragile trust. The fragile piece shattered on the third night. Maya was in the kitchen, washing the small dish she used for Smoke's wet food. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant, rhythmic rumble of Smoke's purr from the living room. Then, a sound cut through the quiet, sharp, frantic, repetitive. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was coming from the living room. Maya turned off the faucet, drying her hands quickly. She approached the doorway cautiously. Smoke wasn't in the box with the kittens. They were sleeping, undisturbed. The sound came again, urgent, almost desperate. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Maya peered around the doorframe. Smoke was in the far corner of the room, near the old brick fireplace that hadn't been used in years. She was standing on her hind legs, her front paws braced against the wooden baseboard. And she was scratching. Not casually, like a cat sharpening claws. Frantically, intensely focused. Scritch, 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 scritch. Her claws dug into the old, painted wood, leaving faint white marks. Her body was rigid, tail held stiffly down, ears flattened not in fear, but in fierce concentration. A low, guttural growl vibrated in her chest, completely unlike her nursing purr. It sounded haunted. Smoke! Maya called softly, stepping into the room. Smoke didn't startle. She didn't even glance at Maya. Her entire being was focused on that spot on the baseboard. Scritch, scritch, scritch. She paused, sniffed the wood intensely, her nose pressed right against the scratches, then resumed with renewed vigor, a small, distressed chirp escaping her. It was obsessive, compulsive. Maya's heart pounded. What was she doing? Was there a mouse in the wall? The sound of tiny claws? But Smoke's behavior didn't seem predatory. It felt panicked, driven by something deeper. Maya remembered the look of guilt, the blood-stained toy, the dead kitten. Was this connected? Some buried trauma resurfacing? She approached slowly. Smoke? What is it, girl? What's there? This time, Smoke did react. She whipped her head around, her eyes wide, dilated almost black in the dim light. The look on her face wasn't recognition, it was pure, unadulterated terror. Not of Maya, but of something else. Something unseen. She hissed, a sharp, explosive sound, then leaped away from the baseboard, landing low to the ground, hackles raised, staring wildly at the spot she'd been scratching as if expecting a monster to emerge. Then she darted back to the kitten box, scrambling inside, huddling over her babies, her purr replaced by a tense, high-pitched whine. She kept staring towards the corner, her body trembling. Maya stood frozen. The warmth of the room vanished, replaced by a sudden chill. The innocent scratching had morphed into something deeply unsettling. This wasn't random behavior. This felt like a ghost scratching at the door of Smoke's mind. What memory, what terror, was locked behind that baseboard? Was it connected to the lost kitten? To something older? Something that happened before the woods? She walked cautiously to the corner. Kneeling, she examined the baseboard. Just old painted wood, slightly chipped. The scratches Smoke had made were superficial. She pressed her ear against it. Nothing. Just the settling sounds of an old house. Yet, the air around the spot felt charged, thick with the residue of Smoke's terror. She looked back at the box. Smoke was still trembling, her gaze fixed on the corner, her body shielding her kittens. The peaceful sanctuary Maya had created felt suddenly fragile, threatened not by an external predator, but by an internal demon Smoke carried. The mystery deepened, twisting from the tragedy of the nest into something darker, more personal, scratching relentlessly at the fragile walls of trust they'd built. The shared grief was now shadowed by an unexplained fear. Why this spot? What did Smoke believe was buried there? The question hung heavy in the quiet room, unanswered, a discordant note beneath the soft breathing of the sleeping kittens. The tension wasn't just rising, it had coiled itself around Maya's heart, cold and sharp. The silence after Smoke's frantic scratching and subsequent terror wasn't peaceful. It was the brittle, charged quiet after a thunderclap, waiting for the next strike. Maya remained kneeling by the innocuous stretch of baseboard, her fingertips tracing the fresh, shallow scratches Smoke had left in the old paint. They felt hot, somehow, vibrating with the echo of the cat's primal fear. The air itself seemed thick, saturated with the residue of an unseen panic that had nothing to do with mice in walls. She turned slowly. Smoke was a gray statue in the dim light filtering from the kitchen, rigidly hunched over her sleeping kittens in the box. Every line of her body screamed tension. Her ears were pinned flat, pupils dilated into bottomless black pools, fixed unblinkingly on the corner where the fireplace met the wall, the source of her sudden horror. The soft, comforting rumble of her purr was gone, replaced by a barely audible high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate from deep within her chest. It was the sound of a creature trapped in a waking nightmare. "Smoke!" Maya whispered, her own voice sounding unnaturally loud in the strained silence. "It's okay, it's just the wall. Just old wood." The words felt hollow, meaningless. This wasn't about the wall. It was about whatever phantom lived behind Smoke's wide, terrified eyes. Smoke didn't flick an ear. Her gaze remained locked on the corner, her body trembling minutely. She wasn't seeing the faded wallpaper or the dusty baseboard. She was seeing something else. Something that made her flinch away as if burned, something that turned her nurturing instinct into paralyzing dread. Maya pushed herself up, her legs stiff. The comforting warmth of the kitten-filled room had vanished, replaced by a chilling draft that seemed to emanate from that cursed corner. She walked towards the box, moving with exaggerated slowness, telegraphing her every step. "Hey," she murmured, crouching down a few feet away. "Look at me. It's just me. Just Maya." Slowly, agonizingly slowly, Smoke's eyes shifted from the corner. They met Maya's, but the fear didn't lessen. It mingled with a profound confusion, a desperate plea for understanding Maya couldn't possibly provide. The whine intensified for a second, then choked off into a silent, open-mouthed pant. Her sides heaved. "What happened there, girl?" Maya asked softly, her heart aching. "What did you see? What do you remember?" Smoke just stared, the terror in her eyes a bottomless well. One of the kittens stirred, letting out a faint, sleepy squeak. The sound acted like a jolt of electricity on Smoke. She flinched violently, pressing herself harder over her babies, her gaze snapping back to the corner for a frantic second before returning to Maya. It was a torturous cycle. The kittens anchored her to the present, to her fierce, protective love, but the phantom in the corner threatened to drag her back into a past filled with unspeakable fear. Maya sat back on the floor, leaning against the armchair Dad used to read in. She wrapped her arms around her knees, mirroring Smoke's protective posture in a way she hoped felt non-threatening. She needed to understand, not just for Smoke's sake, but because the cat's terror had become a dark mirror reflecting her own buried anxieties, the fear of failing the kittens, the fear of being consumed by grief, the fear of the echoing silence in the house that was now punctuated by this new, unsettling dread. The shared loss had built a bridge. This shared fear threatened to turn it into a tightrope over an abyss. She watched Smoke. Watched the way her gaze kept darting to the corner, the way her muscles remained coiled tight even as exhaustion began to weigh on her. Watched the way she flinched at ordinary sounds, the creak of the house settling, the distant hum of the refrigerator cycling on. The scratching incident wasn't isolated. It was a symptom, a crack in the fragile dam holding back Smoke's trauma. The next few days were a tense vigil. Maya moved through the house with a new awareness, her senses attuned to Smoke's hypervigilance. The corner by the fireplace became a forbidden zone. Smoke would skirt wide around it, her body low, tail tucked, refusing to even look in its direction when she crossed the room to use the litter box or eat. The kittens thrived, their eyes beginning to open, tiny slits revealing slivers of blue, their movements becoming less wobbly, their mews stronger and more demanding. Smoke tended to them with unwavering devotion, but the deep, contented purr was rare now. Her nursing was often accompanied by that tense whine, her eyes constantly scanning the room, especially towards that corner. Maya tried everything she could think of to ease the fear. She placed a soft blanket near the kittens but away from the corner, hoping Smoke would relax there. She plugged in a fell-away diffuser, hoping the synthetic pheromones would calm her. She played soft classical music. Nothing worked. The phantom in the corner remained, its presence poisoning the sanctuary Maya had tried to build. The breaking point came unexpectedly, triggered by something mundane. Maya was vacuuming the living room rug, a chore she usually did while Smoke was safely sequestered in the bedroom with the kittens. But today, preoccupied with grocery lists and a looming library shift, she'd forgotten. The sudden, roaring whine of the vacuum cleaner erupted in the quiet room. Smoke, who had been dozing lightly beside the kitten box, shot into the air like a scalded cat. A scream, a raw, guttural sound of pure terror Maya had never heard from an animal, tore from her throat. She didn't run for the bedroom or under furniture. In her blind panic, she ran towards the perceived threat, a desperate, zigzagging flight that brought her horrifyingly close to the roaring machine. And then, cornered between the vacuum and the dreaded fireplace wall, She froze. Not the tense stillness of before, but utter, abject paralysis. She flattened herself against the floorboards, belly down, limbs splayed, her head pressed into the corner where the baseboard met the wall, directly beneath the spot she'd scratched. A low, continuous moan vibrated from her, a sound of utter hopelessness and despair. Maya killed the vacuum instantly, the sudden silence almost as jarring as the noise. "Smoke. Oh God, Smoke, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She dropped to her knees, crawling towards the terrified cat, her own heart pounding. Smoke didn't move. She remained pressed into the corner, her body trembling violently, that awful moan continuing. She wasn't reacting to Maya's voice or approach. She was lost, trapped in the memory the vacuum's roar had unleashed. Maya stopped a few feet away, her breath catching. Seeing Smoke like this proud, resilient, fiercely loving creature reduced to a trembling puddle of pure terror, pressed into the very spot that haunted her, was shattering. It wasn't just fear, it was trauma relived. The vacuum's noise hadn't just startled her, it had been a key unlocking a prison of horrific memory. And the prison door was right here, beneath this baseboard. "What happened to you?" The question screamed in Maya's mind, louder than the vacuum ever had. The blood-stained toy, the dead kitten, the obsessive scratching, the paralyzing terror, they weren't random. They were pieces of a story etched in pain on this cat's soul. A story centered on this spot. A cold resolve washed over Maya, momentarily eclipsing her own fear and pity. She couldn't leave Smoke trapped like this. She couldn't let this phantom control their lives, poison the safety of the kittens. She had to break it open. She had to see what was behind that baseboard, not for curiosity, but as an act of desperate rescue. For Smoke. "Okay," Maya whispered, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Hey, Smoke. I'm going to look. I'm going to see." She stood up, ignoring Smoke's continued moan. She went to the kitchen, returning with a flathead screwdriver and a small pry bar from Dad's toolbox. Tools he'd used to fix loose trim, tools that smelled faintly of his hands. The weight of them felt alien, dangerous. She knelt beside the paralyzed cat, careful not to touch her. "I'm right here," she murmured. "I'm not leaving you." Then, taking a deep breath, Maya inserted the tip of the screwdriver into the seam where the baseboard met the floor, right next to where Smoke's head was pressed. The wood was old, the paint cracked. It resisted for a moment, then, with a soft crack, the thin trim board splintered slightly as she levered the screwdriver. She moved along the seam, prying gently but firmly, the sound of wood groaning and paint flaking away loud in the silence. Each crack, each splinter felt like a violation, but Maya pushed on, driven by the sight of Smoke's trembling form. Finally, a section of the baseboard about a foot long came loose. Maya carefully pried it away from the wall, revealing the dark, dusty cavity beneath. A wave of stale, dry air, thick with the scent of ancient dust, mouse droppings, and something else, something faintly sour and organic, wafted out. Maya grabbed her flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the narrow space behind the baseboard. Spiderwebs glistened like ghostly lace. Thick layers of dust coated the rough floorboards and the brick foundation of the fireplace. And there, tucked into the very back corner, pushed deep into the shadows where the wall met the brick, was something that wasn't dust or debris. It was small, made of fabric, gray fabric. Maya's breath hitched. Using the screwdriver like an extension of her hand, she carefully, gently, nudged the object closer. It was small, limp, She hooked it carefully and slowly drew it out into the light. It was another felt mouse toy, identical to the blood-stained one Smoke had brought her in the rain. Crudely sewn, the same cheap gray felt. But this one wasn't stained with blood. It was matted, stiff in places, and it was covered in a thick layer of grayish dust and cobwebs. It had been there for a long, long time. But that wasn't all. Nestled beside it, almost hidden, were tiny, brittle fragments. Maya shone the light closer. Those tiny, delicate bones. The size of a small bird's or a kitten's. Desiccated. Ancient. The pieces slammed together in Maya's mind with the force of a physical blow. The scratching wasn't random. It wasn't about mice. It was about this. About this hidden tomb. About another kitten. Another loss. Long ago. Trapped? Hidden? Died here? Smoke hadn't been trying to get in. She'd been reacting to the memory of something terrible that happened here, perhaps trying, futilely, to reach what was lost, or to warn against the danger this spot represented. The vacuum's roar had mimicked whatever terrifying sound had accompanied that ancient trauma, a slamming door, a shout, machinery, catapulting her back into that moment of primal terror and loss. The identical toy was a relic of that other litter, a ghost of another tragedy. The phantom wasn't just in Smoke's mind, it was buried in the bones of this house. Maya dropped the screwdriver. It clattered on the floorboards, the sound shockingly loud. She stared at the pitiful little toy and the tiny bones in the beam of her flashlight. Tears blurred her vision, hot and sudden. Not just for the long-dead kitten, but for Smoke. For the unimaginable weight of grief and terror she'd carried alone. For the way this hidden horror had resurfaced, triggered by the vulnerability of new motherhood, by the recent loss of her own baby in the woods. The dead kitten in the stump wasn't her first loss. This was the original wound, festering unseen for years, now ripped open. A soft sound broke the silence. Not a moan, not a whine, a sob. A ragged, choked sound that seemed torn from a creature incapable of human tears. Maya looked down. Smoke had lifted her head. She wasn't pressed into the corner anymore. She was staring at the objects Maya had pulled from the wall, the dusty gray mouse, the tiny bones. Her green eyes were wide, but the blind terror was gone, replaced by a profound, soul-crushing sorrow. Recognition. Acknowledgement. The phantom had a face now. It was the face of her own past grief, made tangible. She looked from the relics to Maya's tear-streaked face. And then, something extraordinary happened. Smoke didn't run, didn't hiss. Slowly, tremblingly, she pulled herself up. She took one step, then another, away from the cursed corner. She walked towards Maya, her movements stiff with residual fear and exhaustion, but her gaze fixed on Maya's eyes. She stopped inches away. She lowered her head and nudged her forehead gently, tentatively, against Maya's knee. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even affection, not yet. It was a surrender, an offering of shared understanding. You see what happened. You see my pain. The dam holding back Maya's own grief, for her father, for the lost kitten, for Smoke's hidden suffering, finally broke. Sobs racked her body. She didn't reach to pet Smoke, afraid to shatter the moment. She simply bowed her head, her tears falling onto the dusty floorboards beside the tiny bones and the forgotten toy. Smoke remained there, her forehead resting against Maya's knee. She didn't purr. She didn't move. She just stayed, sharing the weight of the revealed sorrow. The terrible, hidden thing was out. The phantom was named. The scratching had stopped. In its place was a raw, shared vulnerability, a silent communion in the dusty light, built on the unbearable truth of loss, finally witnessed. The climax wasn't action, it was the shattering release of a secret too heavy for one small cat to carry alone. And in that shared breaking, the bridge between them, forged in grief and fear, transformed into something stronger, deeper, and irrevocably real. The silence in the wake of shared tears wasn't empty. It was dense, sacred, filled with the dust motes dancing in the flashlight beam and the profound weight of the truth laid bare. Maya's sobs subsided into shaky breaths, her cheek pressed against her knee, the rough denim damp with tears. Smoke remained, her forehead a warm, solid pressure against Maya's other knee. The terrible moan had stopped. The frantic trembling had eased into a deep, bone-weary quiver. Her eyes, no longer dilated with terror, held an exhaustion so profound it mirrored Maya's own. They simply existed in the aftermath, woman and cat, bound by the terrible relics scattered on the dusty floorboards, the ancient, desiccated mouse toy and the tiny, fragile bones. Maya finally lifted her head, her vision blurred. She looked down at Smoke. The cat met her gaze, her green eyes holding a depth of understanding that transcended species. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was acknowledgement. A shared burden. You see. Smoke gave a tiny, almost imperceptible sigh, her body sagging further against Maya's leg. The fight, the terror, had drained out of her, leaving only a profound weariness and a fragile, newfound trust. The practicalities slowly filtered through Maya's emotional haze. The kittens. They were stirring in their box, emitting soft, hungry squeaks. Smoke's ears twitched towards the sound. Maternal instinct, the strongest force she knew, pulled at her even in her exhaustion. She gave Maya's knee one last soft nudge, a silent communication that felt like stay, or perhaps I must go, then slowly, stiffly, pushed herself up. She didn't look back at the hole in the wall or the relics. She walked, with a deliberate slowness that spoke of utter depletion, back towards the kitten box. She climbed in, curling her body around her babies, and began to lick them, her movements slower, gentler than before. The deep, rumbling purr didn't return immediately. Instead, a low, steady hum vibrated from her chest, a sound of pure, exhausted solace. Maya looked back at the small tragedy revealed in the beam of her flashlight. The dusty gray mouse, twin to the blood-stained one that had started it all. The tiny bones, heartbreakingly fragile. Evidence of Smoke's first, hidden loss. A trauma buried in the bones of this house, festering for years, triggered by new vulnerability and the roaring ghost of whatever past horror the vacuum had mimicked. She couldn't leave them there. Not like this. Moving carefully, her own body aching with emotional and physical fatigue, Maya gathered the small, brittle bones onto a piece of clean paper towel. They felt impossibly light, almost weightless, a stark contrast to the heavy sorrow they represented. She picked up the ancient mouse toy, brushing off the worst of the dust and cobwebs. It was stiff, the felt brittle with age. She placed it beside the bones on the paper towel, folding it gently into a small, makeshift shroud. The blood-stained toy from the woods was still near the kitten box. The symmetry was painful, bookends of loss, years apart. She needed to lay this ghost to rest. For Smoke, for herself, for the tiny life forgotten in the dark. Quietly, Maya stood. She carried the small bundle into the kitchen. Smoke watched her from the box, her eyes heavy-lidded but alert, tracking Maya's movements. Maya found a small, sturdy cardboard box, one that had held tea bags. She lined it with a soft scrap of fleece, then placed the paper towel shroud inside. It looked absurdly small and sad. She taped the box shut. The drizzle had stopped outside, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of damp earth. Maya grabbed a small trowel from the shed and walked into the small, overgrown backyard. Dad's garden. Untended since his death, it was a tangle of late-season flowers gone to seed and hardy weeds. She chose a spot near the old, gnarled lilac bush he'd loved, its leaves already tinged with autumn gold. The earth was soft from the rain. She dug a small hole, deep enough to be safe, and placed the tea box inside. She hesitated, then went back inside. Smoke was drowsing now. The kittens nestled against her, feeding. Maya carefully picked up the blood-stained felt mouse from near the nest. Smoke's eyes opened, watching as Maya carried it outside. She placed it gently on top of the buried box. A companion for the journey. A symbol of all the losses carried, seen and unseen. She filled the hole, patting the damp earth smooth. There was no marker, just the disturbed soil and the lilac bush standing sentinel. Simple, quiet. A final act of respect for a tiny life lost long ago, and for the mother who had never forgotten. Returning inside, the house felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but clear. The oppressive dread that had clung to the corner near the fireplace had dissipated. The phantom had been named, acknowledged, and laid to rest. Maya carefully replaced the section of baseboard she'd pried off, hammering small finishing nails to secure it as best she could. The scratches Smoke had made were still visible, but they were just marks on wood now, not conduits to terror. Life moved forward, but the axis had shifted. The shared breaking point had forged a new understanding between Maya and Smoke. The wary distance evaporated. Smoke no longer flinched when Maya moved suddenly. She no longer ate in frantic gulps, ears swiveling for threats. She began to explore the house, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. She discovered the sunbeam that fell across the living room rug in the late afternoon and would stretch out there, blinking slowly, her purr returning, a deep, resonant sound that filled the quiet spaces. She still preferred the cardboard box for the kittens, but she started venturing onto the armchair near Maya while the kittens slept, curling up in a tight gray circle, one eye always slightly open towards the box. The kittens grew with astonishing speed. Their eyes opened fully, revealing bright, curious blue. Their wobbly walks became playful tumbles and exploratory dashes around the confines of their box. Then, soon after, daring escapes onto the fleece-lined floor surrounding it. Maya named them Ember, a smoky gray tabby like her mother; Pebble, a solid, sturdy gray; Ash, a softer, lighter gray; and Willow, a delicate gray with faint tabby stripes. Their tiny mews became demanding chirps and playful squeaks. They discovered Maya's fingers, batting at them with minuscule, needle-sharp claws. They discovered Smoke's tail, pouncing with comical ferocity. Maya's days revolved around them. Feeding Smoke high-calorie food, cleaning the litter box, gradually introducing the kittens to slurry as they weaned. The constant, gentle chaos was a balm. The silence of the house was now filled with the sounds of life, tiny paws skittering, contented purrs, the soft thump of a kitten landing awkwardly after a jump. The numb fog that had enveloped Maya since her father's death began, incrementally, to lift. Caring for these fragile lives demanded presence. It demanded getting out of bed. It demanded focusing on the next feeding, the next cleaning, the next tiny milestone. She found herself talking to Smoke constantly, not just narrating actions, but sharing thoughts. Look at Ember, trying to climb the box side again, the little daredevil. Pebble ate almost all his slurry today, such a good boy. The lilac leaves are turning gold, Smoke. Dad loved that bush. The words flowed easier now. The grief was still there, a constant ache beneath her ribs, but it wasn't the only thing occupying the space. It shared the room with wonder, with exhaustion, with the fierce, protective love she felt for this little feline family she'd been entrusted with. One crisp October afternoon, sunlight streaming through the window, Maya sat on the floor near the kitten play area. Willow was industriously trying to bury an imaginary treasure in the fleece. Ash was attempting to scale Maya's jeans leg. Smoke lay nearby in a patch of sun, watching her brood with half-closed eyes, the deep purr resonating. Maya reached out slowly, not towards the kittens, but towards Smoke. Her hand hovered near the cat's head. Smoke watched the hand approach, her gaze calm, unafraid. Maya gently touched the fur between Smoke's ears. It was soft, warm, vibrating with her purr. Smoke didn't pull away. She didn't tense. She simply closed her eyes fully, leaned ever so slightly into the touch, and purred louder. A deep, contented thrum that seemed to vibrate up Maya's arm and settle in her own chest. It was the first time Smoke had accepted, even welcomed, physical contact that wasn't born of necessity or fear. Tears welled in Maya's eyes, but they were different this time. Not tears of shared sorrow or shattering grief. They were tears of profound, quiet connection, of trust earned, of a bridge crossed. She gently stroked the soft fur, tracing the faint silvery scar on Smoke's muzzle, a testament to a life lived hard before they met. Smoke's purr deepened, a sound of pure, uncomplicated peace. Maya looked around the sunlit room, at the kittens tumbling, at Smoke, warm and trusting beneath her hand, at the patched baseboard, just a part of the wall now. The mystery of the scratching, the terror in the corner, was solved. The ghost was laid to rest under the lilac bush. There was no grand fanfare, no dramatic resolution. Just this, sunlight, purring, tiny lives exploring their world, and the quiet understanding that passed between a woman and a cat who had seen each other's deepest wounds and chosen to stay. She still missed her father with a fierceness that could steal her breath. The house still held his absence in every familiar creak and smell. But the paralyzing numbness, the feeling of being utterly adrift, had receded. In its place was purpose. Not the high-pressure purpose of her old city life, but the grounding, essential purpose of caring for creatures who depended on her completely. Smoke had given her that, by trusting her with her vulnerability, her terror, and finally, her trust. Smoke had pulled Maya back from the edge of her own abyss. The routines felt different now. Waking up wasn't just facing the silence. It was greeted by demanding squeaks and the expectant pressure of Smoke's gaze, waiting for breakfast. Meals were shared, Maya at the table, Smoke nearby with her bowl, the kittens soon exploring their own dishes. Nights were no longer long stretches of staring at the ceiling. They were punctuated by the soft sounds of the feline family settling, the comforting vibration of Smoke's purr from the foot of Maya's bed, where she now sometimes slept. It wasn't peaceful in the conventional sense. There were midnight kitten escapades, litter box accidents, the constant vigilance, but it was a vibrant, living peace. A peace built on shared history, hard-won trust, and the simple, profound act of moving forward together, one sunbeam, one purr, one tiny kitten step at a time. The storm hadn't vanished, but they had found shelter within it. And the shelter, Maya realized, looking at Smoke's relaxed face in the sunlight, was each other. Autumn deepened, painting Cedar Creek in fiery hues of crimson and gold. The air turned crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. Inside the house on Spruce Street, life vibrated with a new, chaotic rhythm. The cardboard box was a distant memory. Ember, pebble, ash, and willow ruled the living room rug, a tumbling, pouncing, squeaking hurricane of gray fur and boundless curiosity. They scaled the legs of chairs, launched surprise attacks on unsuspecting socks, and engaged in epic battles over crinkly balls and feather wands. The silence Maya had once drowned in was now a symphony of tiny claws on wood, playful growls, and the constant, comforting undercurrent of Smoke's purr. Her transformation was the quiet miracle. The skittish ghost of the library woods was gone. In her place resided a creature of profound, watchful serenity. She still possessed an innate dignity, a certain reserve, but the fear that had once tightened every muscle had dissolved. She moved through the house with a loose-limbed grace, no longer hugging the walls. She claimed the sunbeam on the rug as her throne, stretching luxuriously, her green eyes half closed in contentment. She supervised her rambunctious offspring with a mixture of weary patience and undeniable pride, intervening only when a wrestling match threatened to topple a lamp or a daring climb became perilous. Her purr was a near-constant presence, a warm vibration that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the home. Maya watched this evolution with a quiet awe. Caring for the kittens was demanding, often exhausting, but it was a joyful exhaustion. The relentless needs, feeding, cleaning, playing, mediating tiny squabbles, anchored her firmly in the present. The grief for her father hadn't vanished. It had simply found a new shape, woven into the fabric of her days. She found herself talking to him more often, not in prayer, but in quiet updates whispered while washing kitten dishes or watching them sleep. "Dad, you should see Ember today." She scaled the bookcase. Pebble finally figured out the scratching post. Ash is the cuddler, just wants to burrow into your neck. Willow watches everything just like her mama. Willow was different. While her siblings tumbled and roared, Willow possessed a quiet intensity. She was Smoke's shadow, observing the world with wide, thoughtful blue eyes that seemed to hold an ancient wisdom. She wasn't timid, she was simply contemplative. She'd sit beside Maya while the others played, a small, warm weight leaning against her leg, purring a soft, steady rhythm. She had a particular affinity for the patched section of baseboard. Not fear, like Smoke's past terror, but a quiet curiosity. She'd sit before it, tail neatly wrapped around her paws, and just stare, as if listening to whispers only she could hear. One chilly November morning, a Saturday, dawned bright and clear. Frost silvered the grass in the backyard, and the last stubborn leaves clung to the old lilac bush, now mostly bare branches reaching towards the pale blue sky. Maya sat at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee, watching the kittens engage in their morning ritual of chasing dust motes in the sunbeams. Smoke lay nearby, a picture of regal repose, occasionally opening one eye to monitor the chaos. Willow, however, wasn't playing. She sat by the back door, her small nose pressed against the glass, staring intently into the yard. Her tail twitched, not with playfulness, but with focused interest. Maya watched her, a small smile playing on her lips. "What do you see out there, little one?" "Sparrows." Willow didn't turn. She gave a soft, insistent mew, unlike her usual playful chirps. It was a sound of purpose. She looked back at Maya, then pawed gently at the glass door. "Come see." Curious, Maya set down her mug. "All right, Miss Willow." Show Mama what's so fascinating. She slid open the back door. The cold air rushed in, making the other kittens pause their game momentarily, ears perked. Willow didn't bolt outside like her siblings might have. She stepped delicately onto the frosty patio stones, her breath puffing little clouds. She walked with deliberate steps, not towards the bird feeder or the shed, but directly towards the gnarled lilac bush. Maya followed, pulling her sweater tighter around her. Under the bare branches, near the base where Maya had dug the small grave weeks before, Willow stopped. She sat down, her gaze fixed on the patch of earth. The frost had melted there, warmed perhaps by the morning sun or the lingering memory of life beneath. But it wasn't the earth itself that held Willow's attention. Maya crouched beside her, following her gaze. Tucked almost invisibly against the rough bark of the lilac, sheltered by a curl of dead leaf, was a single perfect bloom. A lilac bloom. In November. It was small, perhaps only half the size of the springtime clusters, but undeniably real. 5 tiny petals, a delicate, pale lavender hue, unfurled bravely against the gray bark and the frost-tipped grass. It was impossible. A defiance of seasons, a quiet rebellion against the dying of the light. Maya gasped softly. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the fragile blossom, afraid to touch it. It was real, cool to the touch, smelling faintly, impossibly, of spring, that sweet, heady scent of renewal. Tears, unexpected and warm, sprang to her eyes. A lilac bloom. On this bush. In this spot. She looked down at Willow. The little gray kitten looked up at her, her blue eyes clear and knowing. She gave another soft mew, then gently nudged Maya's hand with her head, urging her towards the flower. See? See what I found? For you. It wasn't Smoke who had led her to the nest, not this time. It was this quiet, watchful daughter. And the gift wasn't a blood-stained plea, but a fragile, impossible blossom on sacred ground. Maya carefully cupped the tiny bloom, its stem cool and slender between her fingers. She lifted it, bringing it to her nose. The scent was faint but unmistakable lilacs. Her father's lilacs. Blooming over the resting place of Smoke's first, hidden sorrow, revealed by the quietest of Smoke's kittens. The symbolism washed over her, profound and wordless. Life persisting. Beauty emerging from grief. Secrets held by the earth, witnessed by the innocent, offered as a gift. It felt like a message. From the earth? From the universe? From her father? Or perhaps simply from the quiet resilience of life itself, whispered through the intuition of a small gray cat. She looked back at the house. Smoke stood framed in the doorway, watching them. Her green eyes, usually so serene, held a depth Maya hadn't seen before. Not surprise, but a deep, quiet knowing. As if she'd expected Willow to find this. As if she understood the significance blooming in Maya's heart. Smoke gave a slow, deliberate blink, the ultimate feline gesture of trust and affection. See? Willow rubbed against Maya's ankle, purring her soft, steady purr. Maya stayed crouched by the lilac bush, the impossible bloom cradled in her palm. The cold seeped through her jeans, but she barely felt it. The frantic energy of the other kittens, tumbling out the door now to investigate the frosty grass, seemed distant. In this moment, it was just her, Willow's quiet presence, Smoke's watchful gaze from the threshold, and this small, defiant miracle. She thought of the journey. The rain-slicked parking lot, the blood-stained toy, the hollow stump, the tiny lives saved and the one lost. The terror in the corner, the hidden bones, the shared breaking point, the quiet rebuilding, the daily rhythms of care, the purring solace, the gradual unfurling of trust. And now this, a flower blooming out of season, on hallowed ground, found by the most observant of souls. It wasn't just a flower. It was a benediction, a confirmation, a final, gentle reveal from the universe, delivered by tiny paws and watchful eyes. The impact of this small feline family became crystal clear, not just in filling the silence, but in reshaping her understanding of loss, resilience, and connection. Smoke hadn't just led her to orphan kittens, she'd led Maya back to herself. Back to a world where beauty could bloom unexpectedly, even in the frost, especially where sorrow had been tenderly laid to rest. The decision crystallized in that moment, as clear and undeniable as the lavender petals against her skin. She couldn't let them all go. The thought of Smoke, or any of them, leaving this sanctuary they'd built together, felt like tearing out a piece of her newly healed heart. The logistics were daunting, 5 cats. But the rightness of it settled deep in her bones, warm and certain. She stood up, the precious blooms still held gently. Willow followed at her heels. Maya walked back towards the house, towards Smoke waiting in the doorway. She knelt, bringing the bloom level with Smoke's gaze. "Look what Willow found, Mama," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Under your lilac. For us." Smoke leaned forward, sniffing the delicate petals. Her purr, already present, deepened into a resonant rumble that vibrated the air. She looked from the flower to Maya's face, then gently, deliberately, butted her head against Maya's hand holding the bloom. Acceptance. Gratitude. A shared recognition of the gift. Maya looked past Smoke, into the warm, lively chaos of the house. Ember was attempting to scale the couch. Pebble was batting a dust bunny. Ash was curled in a sunbeam. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. This was her family. Her unexpected, purring, chaotic, healing family. She rose, the impossible lilac bloom a tiny beacon in her hand. She walked inside, Willow padding beside her, Smoke falling into step on her other side. The decision wasn't spoken aloud, not yet. But it hung in the air, as fragrant and real as the flower, as solid as the trust in Smoke's green eyes. The final gift wasn't just the bloom, it was the revelation of belonging. They were home. All of them. And Maya knew, with a certainty that warmed her more than any radiator, that she would find a way. She would keep them. This was where their story, intertwined and irrevocable, would continue. The nest of orphans had become her anchor, their shared history the roots, and this impossible bloom the first fragile promise of a future tended together. The impossible lilac bloom, fragile and defiant in Maya's palm, wasn't just a flower. It was a key turning in a lock deep within her, releasing a flood of certainty that washed away the last lingering doubts. The decision, whispered on the frosty air to Smoke and Willow, solidified into unshakable resolve. They would stay. All of them. This chaotic, purring constellation of rescued souls was her family now. The house on Spruce Street, once a museum of grief, had become their shared sanctuary, their imperfect, vibrant shelter. Winter settled over Cedar Creek like a thick, gray quilt. Snow piled softly on the gnarled branches of the lilac bush, covering the sacred ground where tiny bones rested and magic had briefly bloomed. Inside, the world was a riot of warm fur and boundless kitten energy contained within 4 walls. Ember, Pebble, Ash, and Willow were no longer fragile newborns but sturdy, adventurous juveniles, their blue eyes deepening into shades of amber and green. They ruled the radiators, conquered the bookshelves, much to Maya's resigned amusement, and turned dust bunnies into prized prey. The cardboard box was long gone, replaced by plush beds strategically placed in sunbeams and a towering cat tree that became the stage for daily acrobatic displays. Smoke's transformation was complete. The skittish ghost was a memory. She moved with a queenly grace, her sleek gray coat gleaming. The haunted look had vanished entirely from her green eyes, replaced by a deep, watchful serenity. She observed her boisterous offspring with a mixture of weary tolerance and undeniable pride, intervening only when play grew too rough or a daring leap threatened disaster. Her purr was the constant, comforting bass note of their home, a sound that resonated in the floorboards, vibrated through the couch cushions, and seeped into Maya's bones like a healing balm. She claimed Maya's lap in the evenings as her rightful throne, curling into a warm circle of trust, her head resting contentedly against Maya's arm. The scar on her muzzle was just part of her story now, a testament to survival, not a brand of fear. Maya's own healing was woven into the daily fabric of their lives. The paralyzing grief for her father hadn't vanished, it had transformed. It was no longer a suffocating fog, but a quiet companion, a bittersweet melody woven into the symphony of purrs and playful squeaks. She found herself talking to him constantly, naturally, as she went about her days. "Dad, you'd laugh at Pebble. He just tried to help me shelve books by batting the Dewey Decimals off the spines." Ember discovered the joy of knocking pens off the desk. "Ash is currently attempting to become one with my sweater. Willow's just watching, taking notes, I think." She visited his grave regularly, often with a feline escort. Sometimes Smoke sitting quietly beside her, sometimes a curious kitten, usually Willow, exploring the nearby grass. The silence there was different now, peaceful, filled with memory, not hollowed by absence. She kept her part-time job at the library, the rhythm of books and quiet patrons a grounding counterpoint to the joyful chaos at home. But a new purpose had taken root, inspired by the impossible lilac and the journey that led her here. She started documenting their life. Not for fame, but as a quiet testament, a lifeline thrown into the digital void. She set up a simple camera on a shelf, capturing unguarded moments. Smoke bathing a squirming Ember with long, patient licks. Pebble's triumphant capture of a crinkly ball. Ash curled deep in sleep, a tiny gray comma. Willow sitting contemplatively by the patched baseboard, not with fear, but with a quiet, knowing gaze. Maya narrated sparingly, her voice warm and calm, sharing snippets of their story, the rescue, the hidden sorrow revealed, the blossoming of trust, the daily absurdities and profound joys. She called it the Hearthside Chronicles. A name that felt right, warm, encompassing, a refuge. She ended each short clip with a simple, genuine line. "Find your shelter. Tend your hearth. There's always room for one more at the fire." One blustery March afternoon, the promise of spring a whisper in the still chilly air, Maya sat at the old oak table in the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing like tiny stars. Smoke lay draped across her lap, a warm, purring weight. Ember and Pebble were engaged in a mock battle over a felt mouse, a new one, thankfully unstained, under the table. Ash was stretched out on the sunny linoleum, a picture of blissful laziness. Willow sat on the windowsill, watching a lone sparrow brave the wind. Maya was editing a clip from that morning. Willow gently batting at a sunbeam, Smoke watching from her rug throne, a look of deep contentment on her face. The simple beauty of it, the quiet peace they had fought so hard to build, caught in her throat. She added the final narration, her voice soft but clear. It started with a look, a plea in the rain, a blood-stained offering that wasn't violence, but a broken heart crying out. It led to a hollow stump, to life clinging on in the shadows, to loss that echoed another, older loss buried deep. It led through fear that scratched at the walls, to a breaking point shared in dust and tears, to a tiny grave under a lilac bush, and to a blossom that shouldn't have been. It led us here, to this sunlight, to this purr vibrating through my bones, to this chaos, this warmth, this utterly imperfect, perfect shelter we've built together. She paused, looking around at her family. Smoke opened one eye, gazing up at her with unwavering trust. Willow turned from the window, her intelligent eyes meeting Maya's. Ember pounced on Pebble, eliciting an indignant squeak. Ash sighed in his sleep. This story, Maya continued into the microphone, her voice thick with emotion she didn't try to hide, isn't just about rescuing cats. It's about how they rescued me. How grief can be a chasm, but connection is the bridge, however fragile it seems. How the deepest wounds, when witnessed, when shared, can become the strongest bonds. How life, against all odds, insists on blooming, even in November, especially where you least expect it. She saved the clip, uploaded it to the Hearthside Chronicles, added the simple sign-off, tend your hearth, find your shelter. There's always room for one more at the fire. Then, almost as an afterthought, a genuine wish spilling from her own gratitude, she typed, "If these chronicles of fur, trust, and unexpected blossoms warm your heart, help us spread the warmth. Share this story. Subscribe to see the kittens grow, witness Smoke's watchful peace, and find moments of quiet connection. Ring the bell so you never miss a chapter of our imperfectly perfect shelter. Because sometimes, the softest purr, the bravest bloom, the quietest act of trust, that's where the real magic lives." She clicked publish. It wasn't a demand, but an invitation, an extension of the hearth she'd built. Later that evening, the wind howling outside, the house was a cocoon of warmth and soft sounds. The kittens were finally asleep in a tangled heap of gray fur on the cat tree. Maya sat on the couch, a book open but unread on her lap. Smoke lay beside her, pressed close along her thigh, her deep purr resonating like a contented engine. Rain began to patter against the windows, a gentle percussion to Smoke's rhythm. Maya looked out at the wet, dark street, the streetlights casting shimmering halos on the pavement. She remembered standing in the library parking lot, lost in a gray world, feeling the rain seep into her bones and her soul. She remembered the desperate green eyes, the blood-stained toy, the leap of faith into the dripping woods. She looked down at Smoke, her solid, warm presence. She listened to the soft breathing of the sleeping kittens. She felt the quiet pulse of life within these walls, a life she had saved, and a life that had irrevocably saved her. The message wasn't grand. It was simple, woven into the purr against her leg, the memory of a November bloom, the trust in a green-eyed gaze that had seen the worst and chosen to stay. Love isn't always loud. Rescue isn't always dramatic. Healing isn't a straight line. Sometimes, it's a feral cat trusting you with her broken heart and her fragile young. Sometimes, it's choosing to stay, to build a shelter together against the storm. Sometimes, it's the quiet, persistent miracle of a purr in the dark, a testament to the fact that even the most wounded souls can find peace, can build a hearth, can bloom again. The rain whispered against the glass. Smoke's purr deepened. The shelter held. It wasn't perfect. It was messy, chaotic, filled with claw marks on furniture and early morning demands. But it was real. It was warm. It was theirs. And as Maya rested her hand gently on Smoke's head, feeling the vibration travel up her arm and settle deep within her own, finally healed heart, she knew this was the only ending there could ever be. Not an ending at all, but a quiet, enduring beginning. A shelter built together, one purr, one brave blossom, one act of trust at a time. And within its walls, life, against all odds, bloomed. The end. For now. P.S. Ember just knocked over a picture frame. The Hearthside Chronicles continue. Like this journey of trust and unexpected blooms? Subscribe to the Hearthside Chronicles for daily moments of furry resilience and quiet magic. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a kitten's first leap or Smoke's serene wisdom. Share this story. Every view helps spread the warmth of second chances. Because sometimes the most powerful tales are whispered in purrs,